Welcome back to Hobby Basics. I'll be your instructor for today, Dana Howell, and today we're going to be tackling the subject of model assembly and preparation. Hobby Basics is an online video series geared towards teaching you the fundamentals of the miniature painting hobby in the format of a college-level art class. If this is your first time watching, I would encourage you to start at the beginning. And if you're watching this in the year 2020 on YouTube, I'm going to be putting a link to the full playlist right here, as well as down in the description. With that out of the way, let's begin. For today's class, you're going to need the following supplies. At the time of this video, this should cost you about $26 in US dollars, or a bit more than that in Canadian dollars, thanks to our terrible exchange rate. If you look in the description, you'll find links to a few of these different tools. However, these are affiliate links, which means I get a cut of whatever you buy, just so that disclaimer is out of the way. However, feel free to buy these tools from wherever you can find them cheapest. Often, a hardware store or a hobby store is the right place to go to buy these sorts of tools. The models we're going to be assembling today are the heroic Stormcast Eternals from the commonly available wargame Warhammer Age of Sigmar. You can find these specific models in stores for around $15 for a set of 3. They are also available from other places such as the Mortal Realms subscription service or in a combo box called Stormstrike, which gives you these models and a few other models. If you can't find these models for any reason, this assembly guide will apply to pretty much any Stormcast model that you can find, and there's a lot of them out there. You might already even have some. If you're attending this class, I'm assuming this is a skill that you want to develop. And if you want to develop this skill, I'm going to recommend up front that you dedicate some sort of space within your home to pursuing this hobby. If you live in a very crowded city like I do and have limited living space, it's perfectly understandable that you can't devote a large amount of the space in your home to this hobby. In that case, I recommend you have some sort of box which you keep organized and you can easily take out to work on whenever you have the time. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's go to our hobby desk and get started on Hobby Basics 101, Assembly. Welcome to the practical portion of today's class. When you purchase many different types of models, any models from Games Workshop, they're going to come on these things called SPRUES. Several other companies do this as well. Some companies, they come pre-cut off the SPRUES or pre-assembled. But I wanted to give you the experience of cutting models off of SPRUES because it's a good skill to have. So before we paint these, we want to cut them off the SPRUES and we're going to need to assemble them. In order to do that, we're going to need a set of clippers. So you can use any sort of model clippers. The ones that I'm going to recommend you buy are called Play-Doh model shears. Play-Doh Model 170 shears. Sorry, they're just called Play-Doh shears. These are not intended for putting together models. These are actually for cutting wire. So they're actually a lot cheaper than your traditional hobby clippers. And I think they actually work a lot better. They're extremely sharp. A little bit dirty because I use them a lot. These are the ones I would recommend. You can buy them for about $6, I think, on Amazon. I'll put the actual price in the description and probably right here in the video. So they're a great value over like the more typically expensive hobby clippers. If you can't find these, I would probably recommend the Army Painter. They're like cheaper hobby clippers. I got these in a set of hobby tools that they sent me. Product provided by Army Painter. So these work just as well. Actually, they don't. These work better. I would recommend these if you can find them. They're a lot sharper. You can see these are okay, but they're not quite as sharp. They're clippers, but they're not like cutters. Which is why I think I like these. They're almost like little knives. Okay, so once you have your clippers, the first thing we're going to do is cut off our first piece off the sprue. And there is actually a technique to this, which is why I thought it was worth devoting time to a video on this. So the first thing you're going to do is consult the instructions. So there's a lot of different instructions for these models depending on where you get them from. I got these from the Mortal Realms subscription service, so this is a piece from the magazine. So you're going to look at the instructions. They're a little bit washed out here. So the first thing we need to clip out is piece number 1. That seems pretty straightforward, but on some models, the first piece you want to clip out is actually not number 1, so it's best to look at the instructions first. So now that we know we need piece number 1, we're going to look at the model sprue, and you can see that all the pieces are numbered. So this one here, with the 1 next to it, is piece number 1. And then we're going to clip out this piece carefully with our clippers. So again, you would think this is straightforward, but there's actually a technique to this. You're going to want to put your clippers not quite flush against the model. So you're going to put the flat of the blade, so this side, against the model, and you are going to want to, I'll film this so you can actually see it, leave a little bit of space between the flat and the model, and then you're going to clip. So you don't want to go too close to the model, because if you go right up against it, you risk cutting off a piece of it. So I like to leave a little room so that you're not losing any part of the plastic. So you can kind of see right there, I've left a little bit of room for Sigmar. It's just a little joke for you there. And it's always better to leave more room than less. So if you have the option between doing this and this, it's totally okay to do this, because we're going to be removing some of those parts later. Okay, so now that the model has been clipped off the sprue, let's take a look. Okay, so you can see that we have some little pieces here that are left over. We left a little bit extra here on purpose, just to show as an example. Little pieces here too. And so what we're going to do with those little parts is we're going to take our hobby knife. In Canada, these are colloquially called X-ACTO knives, but I think that's just the product, brand name. I'm not sure what these are called in other parts of the world. We call them X-ACTO knives, but if you just look up hobby knife, you'll find one of these. They're pretty cheap. They're like between $3 and $5 to get one of these, and they have replaceable blades. So when your blade gets dull, you can untwist this. The blade pops out and you can replace it. You want to be pretty careful with these, because when you first get them, they are quite sharp. So you should be really careful with these. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to use our knife. We're going to hold it like this. I know you're not supposed to hold your knife towards you, so you're supposed to point it against you, but in this case, we're going to be using this knife much like a wood carving knife. So we're going to hold it like this. And we'll take the biggest piece here as an example. Pointing it towards us, we're going to carefully cut this piece off. Actually, I'm going to point it away from me, because it's probably gonna, yeah. And then for the smaller bits, we can point it towards us. So just like that, just gonna carve away all the extra little bits until it's flush with the rest of the surface. Might take a few goes. Okay, so you can see that's relatively flush with the surface. This is just this little piece here. It's like just a function of the gold plastic, I think. But it is flush against it. So you want to go around the model and cut off all the bits. Like that. And then, holding, again, this towards you, you want to scrape until it's completely flat. So, just to show you another example, we are going to cut and then scrape. And it's that simple. So we just go around the model removing any of those bits. Make sure you don't remove any of the pieces that are necessary. And then once you're done that, we are going to look for any mold lines. This piece doesn't really have any mold lines, so let's finish up with this piece and then we'll move on to a piece that has mold lines. And that's pretty much it. So there's one more thing that we need to scrape off, but we need a model that actually has mold lines in order to do that. I don't know if this model has any. Yeah, this model doesn't really have mold lines. Okay, so once you are done with this piece, we're going to set it aside. And we're going to look at the next piece we need to take off. So you can see here in the instructions, it's kind of hard to see, too much light. You can see here in the instructions, it is telling you two different things. And what it is telling you, it's kind of not very intuitive, maybe it is intuitive, is that you can build this model either with number 2 or number 3. So number 2 is the option to build this model without a helmet, and option number 3 is to build this figure with a helmet. So when we look at our sprue, I'm going to look for piece number 2. That's piece number 2. And then we're going to look for piece number 3. That's piece number 3. So we are going to choose to build this model. I mean, it's up to you, but I am going to choose to build this model without a helmet, which means we can leave this on the sprue because we're not going to use it. And we're going to cut this piece off. This piece is a little bit more fragile, so you might want to be more careful. Clip it off, just like we did before. And then we're going to cut off all the little bits, just like we did with the first piece. Scrape them off, or cut and then scrape. Cut. And then scrape. And you're going to want to be careful not to, if you're too rough with it, this piece could bend. So you might want to be kind of careful with that piece. And this one is a bit trickier. we're going to want to cut this piece off. Here we go. Okay, so there is one thing that is different about this piece than this piece. And that difference is that this piece has mold lines. So if you can see, it's very small, but right on the side of the head here, there's this line that goes right down her head. And this line, and there's a lot of other ones on here too. You can see there's another one right here on her leg. These lines are not intentional. They're called mold lines. And they're caused by, these are made with a two-part mold. So you can pretend this is part one of the mold, this is part two of the mold. These lines are caused by the plastic getting smushed between these two molds. So they'll often be along the perimeter of the figure. And it's up to you how much work you put into this, but I like to remove as many of these mold lines as I can because they're really going to stick out on the finished figure. So it's pretty easy. We're going to remove these mold lines using the same technique we used to scrape off the excess there. We're just going to take we're going to take just the edge of our blade or the side of our blade and just scrape them off gently until they're gone. Games Workshop sells special tools for mold line removal, but I have tried these tools and I don't really like them. I find that the easiest and most straightforward tool for this is just the edge of a knife. We're going to do the same thing on the top of her head. You can see the mold line extends all the way across her head. So we're going to do our best to just remove this. Sorry, I'm whispering. I feel like this is kind of it's like a delicate procedure for some reason. My voice gets really whispery. And then on the other side, there's a little bit here too. We're just going to do our best to remove this. You don't want to go too overboard because you can risk removing some of the details from the model. So be careful to try and tell the difference between lines that are there as details on like the armor and lines that are there because they're mold lines. So here's our other mold line we're going to remove. This one's probably a lot easier to see on camera. We're just going to scrape it away from us. And that one's a lot easier to remove. It's pretty straightforward. I think I'm just going to inspect the figure quickly to see if there are any other ones I'm missing. I think that is... Oh, there's one more on the inside of her leg. You can kind of see it. Can you see it? Right there. So we're going to remove that. Just wipe off all the excess. And there we go. So we have our first two pieces cut out. So before we do any assembly, I'm going to cut out all the rest of the pieces for this first model, and then we're going to assemble it once we have all of our pieces. It's up to you in what order you do this, but for me personally, I like to get all the models cut out and trimmed first, and then assemble them, then glue them together, rather than do it one at a time, but it's really up to you. So if we take a look here, The other pieces that we need are number 4, number 6, number 5, so 4, 5, and 6. So I'm just going to speed up this footage as I cut out numbers 4, 5, and 6, and I will slow it down if I come across anything that I feel is worth noting. So I will see you in just a sec. I'm going to time-lapse this next bit. Oh, actually, I'm not going to time-lapse. There's another thing to point out. So right here, you're going to notice something interesting. So on this model, you might be tempted to cut it here, but you actually want to cut it right here. So you can see sometimes on the feet of models, they will have little pegs. So these are actually not, like you can see here, this peg is intentional. And we want to keep this peg on the model because it is going to go into this slot. So just keep an eye out for little things like that on the model. We'll also show that on the instructions that it has these little pegs. So you just want to pay attention when you're cutting these out that you don't accidentally cut off the pegs. Okay, so I'm going to cut and trim this piece. Again, with this piece, it's kind of ambiguous where we're supposed to cut this, but if you look at the instructions, you will see that this little stub at the end is intentional and it's supposed to be kept. So we're going to cut it on the other side of the stub, not at the bottom of the shield. And there's another peg right here. You can see the difference here between the peg and the rest of the sprue. We're going to cut it on this side to maintain the peg. If you do cut off the peg, it's not the end of the world. We can glue it back on. So now that we have all of our pieces cut out, we have two options. We can glue these together, or we can cut out all of the other pieces of the other models first and then glue all of them together at once. So whenever I am building models, I try to batch tasks together, meaning that I would rather do all my cutting, all my trimming first, and then all my gluing. This doesn't seem like a huge deal, but I find that in the long term it saves a lot of time. Especially if you're doing like 10 of these at once, you can save a lot of time by doing all the cutting, all the trimming, and then all the gluing after that. So what I'm going to do is set these aside into a little pile, and I'm going to cut and trim everything from these other two models first. Again, I'm going to time-lapse this bit, and I will stop the camera if I see anything that I feel is notable. Okay, so now that we have everything cut out, it is time to glue them together. So there are a couple different types of glue that we could use to glue these together. But for today, I am going to recommend that we use super glue. Super glue I'm using here is from the Army Painter. They provided this as part of a bunch of free products. Thank you for sending me all that stuff, Army Painter. But honestly, any sort of super glue like I have, this is an old empty one that I have. Any sort of super glue like from the dollar store or a hardware store will work the same way. There are probably brands of super glue that are better, but I would advise you to just get whatever is cheapest, I suppose. I have a couple linked down in the description. But today we are going to be using the Army Painter super glue. If you wanted to, you could also use plastic glue, sometimes called plastic cement, which is, this one's from Games Workshop, which is the type of glue that only works with, I think this is called polystyrene. It only works with this sort of plastic. So it doesn't work with every sort of model. And it's not really glue, it's actually a chemical that melts the plastic and glues it together. Now, the reason that I'm not recommending plastic glue as your first glue to buy is because I think super glue is much more effective for multiple uses. Where plastic glue will work for one thing, super glue you can use for metal models, you can use it for basing, you can use it to glue things around the house. Like, super glue is just a much better choice, I think, for a first glue to buy. You could end up buying some of this later if you want to, but I'm going to recommend as your first purchase for your hobby toolkit to buy yourself some super glue. Before we glue everything together, I have one more little thing to mention, and that is that these models are part of Games Workshop's easy to build line. And what that means is they have these little pegs in here. So technically, you don't actually need glue for these. You could snap them together somehow. They do just like snap together. It's just not working. The pegs just go in the holes. I'm not going to do it because then it'll be stuck together, but technically you do not need glue for these models. The easy to build line also comes with bases that are already textured. So a lot of their standard models will not come with textured bases. They will not come with these little pegs assemblies. But one of the things that I find with these ones with peg assemblies is that they go together a lot easier if you use glue and you trim down, and you trim down these little pegs. So before I glue these together, I'm just going to, you can see right here, I'm just going to trim off a little bit of that and a little bit of that, because it will help it go together just a little bit easier. I'm going to do the same thing on here. Oops. And the same thing on here. If you don't trim these down, what I find happens is there are larger gaps between the pieces of the figure, which is not ideal. Okay, so now we're ready to glue together our first figure. So the way we're going to do this, we're going to take our super glue. You're going to want to be kind of careful. If you haven't used super glue before, I'm kind of guessing you probably have at some point in your life, but if you haven't used super glue before, you do want to be careful. There's all kinds of health warnings on here. Don't get it in your eyes or get it on your skin, wash your skin off. I think it doesn't have any fumes at least. Okay, so we're going to open it up. One of the things I do like about the Army Painter super glue is the applicator. It does have kind of a nice little thing to put together. And then we're going to look at the instructions. So the first thing we need to do is put the head piece into the back piece. So in order to do that, I'm just going to put a little drop of glue in here. Doesn't need very much, just a tiny bit. And where the pegs are. And I will take this and carefully, with trying not to touch the glue, I'm going to put this in here. Oh, I put the glue in the wrong holes. Oh well, it's fine. Just goes in like that. You can see there is a little gap here. We're going to deal with that later. The next step is we're going to put this piece on the front. Since we already have some excess glue on there, I'm just going to do it quickly before the glue dries. Put a little bit on the knee. A little bit on up here. That should be good. Stick this together. Press it together firmly. Pretty good. And I think we did all of that without getting any glue on us. The next thing to put on here is the shield. However, you're going to notice when I put the shield on here, there is one issue. And the issue is that it makes it really hard. It's going to be really hard to paint inside of there. It's going to be really hard to paint the back of the shield. It's going to be really hard to paint the underside of the arm. And it's going to be hard to paint the inside here of the robes. So we have a few options. We can assemble it like this. We can glue it together, or we can do what's called a sub-assembly, which is we'll put it together temporarily right now. We'll just stick it together without glue. And then when we're painting it, we can still remove this. We can remove the shield when we want to and paint the shield separately. And then once we're done painting the model, we can glue the shield together and we can glue the figure to the base. So for now, I'm going to leave this as sub-assemblies. I think that's how you say that. And we're going to leave, oops. Okay, so I'm going to leave her like this. I'm going to quickly put together the other figure, the next figure, and I'm going to do the same thing. It's a very similar assembly. You put the figure inside like this. Oh, right, we're going to clip off the excess to help it fit smoother together. So we're just going to clip off these little bits. Clip. And nothing there. Just going to clip off these a little bit to help it fit better. Then we're going to glue it together. So just use this middle peg. First piece. There we go. And just like the other one, has a front piece which we're going to glue on. We're just going to put a little bit of glue along all these surfaces. You don't want to use too much glue because there is a chance it could splash back and into your eyes, which would not be good. So I try and use as little as possible. Okay. There we go. This figure has been assembled. The only thing left here is the shield, but again, we're going to leave the shield off. We're just going to keep it snapped on, not glue the shield on, because there's a lot of stuff back here that'll be easier to paint with a removable shield. And same thing with the base. We're just going to snap him onto the base rather than putting him on there permanently. Now on this figure, you can see he has some really obvious gaps right here, and all the way along here. This one is especially bad. So we do our best to get this as flush as possible together. Oh, and up here, this one is terrible. So depending on the figure, some of them have big gaps like this that you're going to want to fill with something. And the option that I'm going to choose for today is going to be super glue. So that's another reason why I chose super glue, because it makes a pretty good gap filler. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a little bit of super glue and just drip it along the entire length of the figure. And just all over where the gaps are, pretty much. And then using the top of the applicator, just kind of smooth it out. Our goal is we want it to seep into the gaps and just fill up the gaps. Careful again not to touch it. But if you do, you can just wash your hands. Okay, so that's not bad. It's going to take a little while to dry. And while we're waiting for that to dry, oh, right, we do the other side too. So just put a little bit of super glue in here. Careful not to put too much on because it can really warp the texture. Just want to do a thin coat of super glue over top of there. Now we're going to set this figure aside. And while it's drying, we're going to put together the final figure. It's very similar to the previous one. Probably just going to time lapse this little bit because it's the same process as the previous one. And like the other figure, we're going to leave off, instead of the shield, we're going to leave the weapon not glued on. Oh, these pegs are already pretty short, so I don't think we need to trim them. Actually, I changed my mind. I'm going to glue the weapon on because I don't want to have a massive gap right here. like the other ones, we're not going to glue it to the base. We're just going to stick it on the base. And then I'm going to fill this gap with super glue, just like we did with the first one, along with the gap up here. Oh, this one has a massive gap over here. That's not good. That's a big gap. Try and push it together. So I feel like that is one of the downsides of these easy to build figures, is they tend to have these sorts of gaps. These annoying little gaps. However, they're extremely cheap and readily available, which is why we're using them for this tutorial. Okay, so we're just going to fill this up with glue, just like the other one. Smooth it out. Okay, so this one's done. I'm going to leave all of them to dry. This one's probably already dry, but this one is probably not quite dry. Yeah, the glue is still wet on the side there. So I'm just going to leave them for about 10 to 15 minutes. Let them all dry, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to scrape off the excess with my knife. The excess glue over the gap lines. I'm going to go wash my hands in case I have any glue on them. Okay, so it's been 20 minutes. Let's take a look. So you can see that the glue has dried pretty completely over the models. It's kind of hard to see on camera. There's kind of a smooth covering here. But what's going to happen is once we put paint on this, it's going to leave a texture unless we do a little bit of scraping. So just like the mold lines, I'm just going to give it a little bit of scraping off the excess until it kind of looks smooth. It's a little bit difficult because this paint or this glue is see-through. It's transparent, so it's a little bit difficult to see if this is actually going to end up smooth, but you just kind of have to do your best. And hope for the best. I tend to scrape off more than I might need to. It's almost like sanding a piece of wood. You just want to get it nice and smooth. And yeah, hope for the best when the model is complete. Of course, it's important to recognize that no model that you paint is going to be perfect, and that's okay. So we're not going to be too picky about this. We're just going to do our best. And embrace the little imperfections that come with miniature painting. I think that's a really important lesson to learn, and something that I definitely didn't learn for the longest time when I was first starting out. Is it's better to embrace the imperfections than to hyperfixate on a detail and never finish something. All right, so I think that's pretty good. Again, it's quite hard to see on camera, and the final test will be once we put a primer on this. It's really the only way we'll be able to see if it's smooth or not, but I have a feeling it's pretty smooth. And yeah, we'll put the shield on here, but I'm not going to glue it on. Then we're going to take this one, and I'm just going to do the same thing on this one. This is a little bit tricky. This one is a little bit harder to mask. I don't feel too good about this, but we'll just do our best. Hopefully it won't be too noticeable. If I had a few more tools, I would probably fill this with some green stuff, but today we're just talking about the basics, and I don't want to add some green stuff to our budget quite yet, so I think for now we're just going to leave this gap and accept the imperfection. All right. So I'm going to wash my hands to get all the glue dust off of them, and clean my workspace. With that said, our 3 figures are done. That's the assembly process completed. With our models complete, that concludes today's class on Hobby Basics 101, Model Assembly. Today, we learned how to cut models from the sprue, trim off the mold lines and excess plastic, glue models together, and fill gaps. Spending time and attention on this process is going to create a much nicer final product, and I think it's worth paying attention to. In addition, I find that this process personally can be quite relaxing, in a nice break from painting when you don't really feel like being too creative, but you want to get something done on your models each day. So you might be wondering, what was the black primer for? Well, to be honest, I just couldn't fit 2 types of primer into the budget for next class, so I had you buy one of them ahead of time because there weren't too many other supplies to buy for this class. This allows us to stay on budget, and in this way I'm not going to ask you to buy more than $30 of supplies for next month's class. The supplies you're going to need for next month's class are the black primer that we bought for this class, white primer, Nuln oil from the Citadel Shades range, as well as pale sand from the Vallejo Model Color range. In addition to that, you're going to need a cheap set of brushes that I'm not recommending that you buy cheap brushes for most of your painting, but for next week we're going to be ruining a few of these brushes. So I'm going to recommend that you buy a cheap set of brushes from the dollar store or your local craft store, nothing over $5, and ideally something that's going to give you a wide range of brushes that we can experiment with without having to worry about maintaining them. I provided some links down below, and in those links you can see the sort of cheap kind of brush set that I would recommend. Your homework for today is to completely assemble these 3 models like we did today in the demonstration, as well as any other 3 models that you might have lying around that you've been neglecting to put together. If you don't have any other models to put together, congratulations, you have no homework for this week. Unless you want to assemble a few more figures on your own, it's up to you. Before we go today, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to my patrons on Patreon. I quite literally could not be making these videos right now without all of the generous supporters that are scrolling past right now on the screen. If you like this video, you might want to check out some of the other hobby tutorials on my channel, which is devoted to videos like these. If you're feeling especially cheeky, you can subscribe and get videos like this in your subscription feed every few weeks. If you'd like to see my daily painting updates, you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram at Dana_Howell. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next class, which will be on zenithal priming and basic brush techniques.